Coming out to speak, and I'm happy to do it. I do this. I'm a member of the board of the Marine Corps Aviation Association, which we just founded a chapter here in the Rocky Mountain chapter. So, anyway, thank you, and thank you all for your service and the patriotism. And at least I've served with every service in here, and to include probably 20 allied countries. And it's that same kind of level of patriotism that carries us forward and gets us through tough times like I'm going to talk about today. So thank you. There's a short bio that I didn't want to put, but Mike forced me to put in there. I don't like to talk about myself, so I'm going to skip over that. If you got questions at the end, I'll cover a little bit about what I have or haven't done. But I did exactly what was asked of me with 100% passion. That's about it. So today, I was an F-18 pilot for most of the 30 years or 29 and a half years I served in the Marine Corps. And I thought I would talk not about that, but about a Battle of Fallujah, because I thought it might be of broader interest to the folks to you, because it covers everything from aviation to infantry to engineers, tankers, basically every phase of combat. And then really to highlight the tremendous efforts and courage that the young Marines and soldiers have displayed over those days in 2004. So that's what I'd like to talk about. So the goal here I'll go through a few of these slides. Stop me at any time, but if you don't stop me, I'll keep going, and then at the end, then we can just break out the coffee and have the conversation that Mike and the museum here guaranteed you, okay? So feel free to get up. I put a few lessons learned here that were born out of your experiences, and I thank you for that, because it saved me probably my life, and as well as a whole bunch of my Marines' lives in combat. And so we'll start with that, if I can get this to go. Where do I got to aim to? Right here?
Yeah, the computer's over here.
Maybe? All right. This is a Marine with technology. This is not unusual, okay? I can work an M16 or a K-bar pretty good. Okay. So I'll just throw a few of these up here. These 5 or 6 slides guided us in our planning for Operation Phantom Fury, which is what it was originally called. And I can't get it to go, so. Nope, this isn't going to work. So if you just hit next, okay? Hit. All right. All right.
Just use the arrows.
It's going. This may not have been, that one may not have been something that some of you had to deal with, but it is now. That happened. Okay. See if I can get it to go again. So those lessons learned were based on your experiences, and I studied those quite avidly before I went into Iraq in March of 2004. Out of the 30 years of employing warfighting skills, I never studied for a job harder than the one I went into here as the division air officer for 1st Marine Division. I was in charge of integrating all aviation and ground fires into an urban fight, one that hadn't been seen since Way City, that some of you may have fought in. And it was the lessons learned that we culled from our experiences in Fallujah in March of that year, on Najaf, southern Iraq, and all of the things that you and the World War II veterans had documented. And that's why it's so important to document our lessons learned, because those are the things that we took into the planning for this. Okay? So as I said, I was the division air officer for 1st Marine Division. My three immediate bosses was Joe Dunford. He's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs now. John Kelly, he's the President's Chief of Staff. And General James Mattis. Those were my three bosses during that time. And I went on to work for General Mattis 3 other times after that. Okay, so it was a pretty good team that we had, as you can tell. They've done fairly well, all except me. They've done well for themselves. And so the overview, many of you recall in March of 2004, Operation Iraqi Freedom was over. We were in a stabilization process. It was between Operation Iraqi Freedom I and Operation Iraqi Freedom II. A couple of Blackwater contractors were driving through the city of Fallujah. I'll explain where that is and why that's important. Where they were ambushed, shot, burned, and hung by a bridge and put on international media, Al Jazeera, and others. And during that time, the Marines had, it had been somewhat peaceful, but Fallujah has always been a haven for insurgent activity, even during Saddam's reign. So that's kind of the background. The enemy that was living in Iraq was a combination. Iraqi, former regime elements of the Iraqi army. There were Syrian fighters, Chechens, you name it. Anyone who wanted to support a jihad against Western ideals and the things born out of the Enlightenment would flow through the Euphrates out of Syria in what was called the Rat Line all the way down into the city of Fallujah. And it was a heck of a place, the Wild West. Okay, we're going to talk about some of those things, if I can get this. So just an overall big picture. Here's Baghdad. This is where I lived for 6 months in Ramadi on the Euphrates River, which is beautiful, by the way. Babylon, you know, Mesopotamia, all the stuff you learned in 5th grade history. And I lived in a palace, one of Saddam's old palaces that we took by force, and it was a very nice location. Nice, let me define nice, it was hardened, okay? And that's what I defined as nice. It wasn't nice in terms of a big palace, but I lived in a shower stall with 6 other folks, but it had 4 feet of concrete on it, which was important because we were being rocketed about 3 times a day, like clockwork, okay? So that's my definition of nice now. When you go to ask your realtor, hey, I'd like a nice home, I look at it and I say, oh, there's no reinforced concrete in the roof here. I'd prefer something else. So halfway in between here, about 40 clicks or kilometers due west of Baghdad, also on the Euphrates River, is a town called Fallujah, and that's where we were. The Al Anbar province basically goes out here and then all the way up the top, and that was what 1st Marine Division during OIF 1 was charged with maintaining and restoring, okay? It's also called the Sunni Triangle. If I can get this to go. Oh, maybe? Oh, well, okay. All right. So again, just big picture, Baghdad, Abu Ghraib prison. Many of you have probably heard about the atrocities that happened there. So we can talk about that afterwards if you want. I used to go there, pick up prisoners, drive them back to Ramadi, and we'd let them out if we didn't have enough evidence. It was the Wild West. People were shooting all over the place. It was crazy. Needless to say, the media was fairly powerful. The bottom line on Abu Ghraib was we lost Marines because it was the biggest recruiting tool of the Iraq War for jihadists. When the jihadists saw what a few folks were believed to have been doing, a stream of jihadists came across the Syrian border to assist. And it greatly complicated our lives in terms of planning for how many insurgents we were going to have to take down or destroy. Here's Fallujah, and this whole corridor was a very violent, hostile place during 2004, probably more so than Baghdad, in my opinion. And I was in both of them, or all of them. So here's a big picture. This is a picture looking east. This is the Euphrates River. Here's the bridge where the contractors were burned and hung. It's a 5 by 5 kilometer or 3.13 mile by 3 mile city. Approximately 269,000 people lived there when I arrived in March of 2004. So a very densely packed city, an old city, a city of mosques, many, many mosques, and many extreme religious fanatics. And I'm not, bashing religion, I'm just bashing fanatics, okay? So it was, when I got there, myself, General Mattis, and one other officer met with who was named the Fallujah Brigade Commander. He was in charge of, this was a deal by Paul Bremer, and, or maybe not by Paul Bremer, but there was a deal cut that he would maintain the city and that he would no longer allow it to be an insurgents-controlled place. Well, we met with him, and there was 2 insurgents on either side of him, and 4 insurgents behind him with AK-47s, and there was 3 of us with M16s on our lap, and we had a nice little chat. And during that time, General Mattis made clear that, you'll read about what we do and I'll clear this place out if necessary, okay? We had gone in March based on those contractors being killed on the bridge. We were stopped for political reasons, and the video, a lot of stuff was put onto the TVs from Al Jazeera and other Middle Eastern, and the political pressure caused us to stop and not finish the job in March. So we get to about March 31st, the end of the beginning of April, and we knew at that point that we were going to be going back. And my job was to develop a plan, a fires integration plan to go back into the city. I was just one small part of the planning, but I was deeply involved with then General Natanski, Joe Latois, several others who were charged with this planning. You can see the Central Services population. The mayor, the mayor was weak-willed, to put it mildly. He was a puppet. During the first Battle of Fallujah, back in March, the insurgents would use the Euphrates River, and they would take their boats, and they would, with a cable, they'd waterproof these crates, and they'd bring in mortars and all sorts of weapons and ammunition and drugs and everything else, and they just tow them real slow under the water. And we found that out towards the end of that early in March, and so I'll talk about how we fixed that problem. Okay, there we go. So this is looking overhead. This was what we called checkpoint 1, the Cloverleaf. Fallujah was basically, they had a cement factory, an industrial district down south. This was an old potato factory. It was the only place that was less than about 100 degrees, in the whole city. And we used it as a morgue later. Obviously, the Euphrates River, the Fallujah Hospital, and then the Jolan district, which is where we thought that intelligence told us the greatest portion of insurgent activity and their command and control nodes relied. And I'll show you a better picture of that. The government center, and then the Hadra Mahmadiyya Mosque, which was a place where for months and months, we, through special operations, we monitored the activities there about what they were going to do. And the messages that they put out became more and more, the rhetoric became more and more violent as the course of the summer went on. So we talked about that, the ambush of the Blackwater. We established a cordon around Fallujah, and for months we didn't go into the city other than special operators, and we checked everyone that went in and out of the city, okay? And what was happening is lots of the local population started to flee, and the closer we got to November, we started to drop leaflets at night. And we said, we're coming, and take our word for it. The U.S. Marines are on the way, and it'd be better if you left, but it's time to leave. And then we increased those leaflet drops 2 weeks out, a week out before the operation, and then the 3 nights before. And we were very successful. And most of the population actually left before the battle started, which was good. Obviously, we don't want to hurt or kill anyone. we also didn't want the insurgents to use them as hostages. And so we provided buses and drove them off. In some cases, those that didn't leave, we helped them leave in the middle of the night before we went in. Okay. So Operation Vigilant Resolve, that was 4 April. I just talked about that. 1st Marine Division, we ceased offensive operations way before 30 April. That was just the official. And then there was just a constant sniper war around the perimeter of Fallujah. And we also had several times where we had insurgent activity that was monitored by unmanned aircraft systems, which were, remember this is 2004, 14 years ago. And so we would occasionally attack them through the use of air power in the city. Okay. In the summer of '04, the Marines, along with the 2-7 Cav and 2-1 BCT, I think it was 2-1 or maybe 2-2, we went into the city of Najaf, which is south of Baghdad, and we had quite a battle there. It wasn't as well documented as Fallujah was, but there was about a 3-mile by 1-mile wide cemetery that was close combat, hand-to-hand fighting, along with a significant sniper activity, and we went in there. Okay, so we also had lots of lessons learned, and the rules of engagement during both of these, where you had to have a hostile intent and a hostile act. All right, and for those of you who have served other places, that the rules of engagement mean everything to a young Lance Corporal with an M16. Who can he shoot? Who can't he shoot? When can I drop a bomb? How much collateral damage is allowed? I can't hit a mosque. And what I'll tell you from Najaf is the Marine and the Army discipline with their fires was incredible. There's a huge mosque in the middle of the city. And I walked through after the battle, and there was one little nick in the side of that mosque, and everything around it was destroyed. Okay? And that tells you that the discipline of the fires that those Marines and soldiers used during that battle. Okay? Collateral damage was a big issue, and during this time, multinational Corps Iraq had a say in what you could shoot or what you couldn't shoot. In other words, what you could target legally. And so the targeting process was cumbersome, it was long, and it was very much not in keeping with hunting insurgents, because that's what we were not against the city. We didn't want to blow up any buildings. We just wanted to destroy the insurgents. And that kind of a targeting scheme didn't work, okay? And so it had to be much more rapid with a much higher tempo. And tempo is something you're going to hear me talk about, because that was what drove all of the planning for this urban fight. Okay? So I already talked about that. Those are just who was there. A lot of criminals. I've talked with lots of them when we'd capture them. We had an Iraqi translator who happened to be the MiG-25 squadron commander, who was a loyal Iraqi, and he helped us as an interrogation. And we would zip tie them and put them in these farm pig pens so they couldn't talk to each other, and then we'd go in and talk to them. Some of them were criminals, some of them were fanatics, and some of them were out of work young men. Okay, and that was kind of how they broke out. Some of them were reconcilable, and the one group that was fanatics were irreconcilable. And there was only one way to handle those, and that was to destroy them, to move them off the battlefield. The other ones we could deal with. So this is kind of a threat overview. It's kind of a busy map. I don't know if there's a pointer on here, so I'll try and do this. So the big red circles, insurgent concentrations all around the city. There's checkpoint 1, the Euphrates River. This is the Jolan hospital here. All those yellow dots are fighting positions that they built up. Remember, they've had from March until November or October now to just build this place up. There was improvised explosive devices all over the city. So lots of Marines were carrying silly string, the stuff that your kids used to carry, so that when you open the door or when you'd spray silly string to catch all the tripwires that you couldn't see in the dark, because the silly string wouldn't trip the wire, but you could see it then. And believe it or not, a can of silly string saved a lot of Marines' lives. Okay, so C2 nodes, lots of berms and roadblocks all over the city. These blue are indirect fire points of origin. So those are, most of the time it was 122 millimeter rockets or 82 millimeter mortars that they would shoot at us. And they would come out of the city, and of course we have technology that can tell you within a 10-digit grid coordinate where it's at. Sniper positions, the big red dots. And this is kind of what we were facing, somewhere between, estimates between 2,500 to 4,000 insurgents deeply entrenched, okay? In all of the buildings, there's thousands and thousands of buildings here. There was false walls that you'd walk through, and with the Iraqi soldiers, they knew the architecture, so they'd bang through the wall and we'd find all sorts of stuff. We'd find drugs, we'd find mortars, artillery, night vision goggles, Russian battle armor, you name it. It was, and I'll show you some pictures of that later. So that was our mission on HR and D+1, 1st Marine Division. So about 13,500 folks are going to line up on the north side of the city, surround the rest of it, and we're going to go in and clear house-to-house fighting during November 7th to the 8th, okay? Well, starting that night. So I'll show you the layout of who is with us. So the end state is destroy the sanctuary of insurgents. That's a pretty simple statement. And then allow Iraqi security to govern Fallujah, okay? I know this is an eye chart, but we always get asked who was there, right? So the first time when we went into Fallujah, most of the insurgents squirted out of the city, and they started to fight all up and down the Euphrates. And we actually had more troops in contact and firefights outside the city of Fallujah in April than we did in it. And so what we wanted, that's why we cordoned the city off, because we wanted to contain all these insurgents and kill them in place rather than allow them to move out. And so this plan that we developed would cover the entire Al Anbar province, and more specifically the entire Euphrates River Valley, where we anticipated that they would slide out. And so we had a lot of folks outside the actual, so we had 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit and the 24th Marine Expeditionary Unit, portions of them outside in western Al Anbar province and northern Babil province. Some of these, I'll just point out, Shawani Special Forces. These were special forces that were loyal only to one general in the former Iraqi army. They were very proficient, and they fought very hard. They were loyal Iraqis, but they were loyal to one man, and his name was General Shawani.
Were they predominantly Sunni?
They were. Not all of them, though. Yeah, not all of them. Battalion, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, we had Azerbaijani forces. A lot of folks didn't know that the Azerbaijanis fought alongside us there, right? Very small country in the Caucasus. I actually went there. We had Black Watch, which is British. They were all in blocking positions and all taking care of the unrest outside the city of Fallujah. Just outside, circling Fallujah and not allowing anyone in or out, was Army, 2 BCT. We had military police. We had more Shawani Special Forces. We had tracks, Iraqi armed forces, and PSYOPs, I guess that was. Okay. So inside the city of Fallujah, we're going to line up 6 U.S. battalions and 4 Iraqi battalions and flow north to south into the city. And so there's about 1,000 infantry in a Marine Corps battalion, and it was a nice match because the Army had Bradleys and tanks, and so the Bradleys would go into the city and penetrate, and then the Marines would spread out and clear in the house-to-house fighting, and that's how it operated. So a few of the folks that are there, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Shawani Special Forces, 14th Artillery, Mike Battery, Tank Company, Small Craft Company. Remember I told you they would use boats? So we had riverine boats, just like you used in Vietnam, a little bit bigger motors and updated, but 50 calibers, 240 Golf, machine guns, night vision goggles, and a squad of Marines to handle anyone that came up and down that river. And that was a very active, very active. We had 2 SEAL team with RCT-1 and 1 with RCT-7. And then Iraqi, 4 battalions of Iraqis lined up, okay? So there was, needless to say, that's a lot of folks. Okay, 13,500 people are going to go into that city. Okay, so this is what it looked like originally. So the main effort originally is going to be right up here. This is the Jolan district. And we're going to line up 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 2-7 Cav. This is the Armored Cav. 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, along with Iraqi forces and Shawnee Special Forces. 2-7 is going to penetrate, and then the Marines are going to go in, spread out, and start doing the house-to-house fighting. Okay? Same thing on the eastern side of the city with blocking forces to the south and north, making sure that no one gets in or out of the city. All right? On the night before the actual penetration, we sent Task Force 3rd LAR along with the 36 Commandos. Those are special forces of the Iraqis, and they're actually quite good. And so that night we came in quietly at night, and we took over the city. We took over the hospital with some limited fighting. It was done both to maintain a blocking position here as well as a feint, thinking that they thought we might be coming across the river. And so that was a very successful first stage. Okay. Interestingly, there's a large railroad track that runs right along the top of here and a railroad station that's right there. And that railroad berm that goes along the top of the city is about a 24-foot high berm, 20-foot high berm. And that was going to cause significant delays in getting our men and equipment through that berm. So we used a little bit of ingenuity and aviation engineering, and we had 4 F-18s come in that morning, and we dropped 8 Joint Direct Attack munitions, 2,000-pound bombs that are GPS guided, and you can actually direct the angle at which they impact. And so we did some weaponeering to determine what the exact impact angle was. And then instead of using D9s, which are military armored bulldozers, to push through that, which would have taken 20 hours, in 0.25 milliseconds, we blew a hole through that thing with 8 2,000-pound bombs with delayed fusing. And then the bulldozers just pushed the rubbish out of the way, and we made a huge corridor for our Marines to come through.
How many openings did you open?
Just one there, yeah. Because, yeah, that was all we needed there to get into the northeast corner. Yeah. The JDAM, that munition was brand new at the time. We had just started, we had just been approved to use it a month prior, and it came in pretty handy. Okay, so I covered all that. These are all the people we had, but my job was to integrate and make sure that we had 10 battalions in a city, a 5x5 kilometer or 3 mile city, and that we could shoot artillery's mortar, have rotary wing and fixed wing fires and AC-130s, have UAVs, SOF and other government agencies. Those are like CIA and other folks that were going to be in the city with us. And do it under procedural control. That was the task I was handed. Figure out how to do this and don't hurt anyone that's not supposed to be hurt, and hurt everyone that's supposed to be hurt, okay? That was the bottom line. So here's how we did it. We already talked about that. So this is kind of from an air perspective now for the aviators that are in the room. What we did is we set up what was called a keyhole template. And the keyhole template is just a term that was used kind of to deconflict folks. But we kind of took it and we built upon that template so that we could lay a template on any city that had significant uprising or violence. We could overlay the city, and aviation fires, airplanes, both fixed and rotary wing, could come in, know how to operate with standard operating procedures, and then we wouldn't have to have positive control, radar tracking of everyone. Because the Marines, we don't have that, okay? Well, we do, but we didn't want to bring it over there. And we said, we can do all this with procedural control, okay? So the big deal was we would overlay this, and I'm looking top down, a 15-mile ring over each city with a 5-mile inner ring that was used for weapons release delivery. And if things broke out in Ramadi, we would lay a ring over there. If they broke back out in Najaf or any other Saqlabiyya, anywhere, we would just lay one of these rings overhead. People would show up, and it was very standardized. Everyone knew what to do, okay? And we took months to brief everyone. We flew out to aircraft carriers. It was mostly a Marine Air Ground Task Force fight, so we had the opportunity to brief all of the Marines in the theater, and every Marine that went into this city had a map, what was called a grid reference graphic, which was a map that had buildings that were numbered so that you could quickly identify which building, and everyone could say, hey, I'm on building 117, that's the building, destroy it, move on. And we were trying to build tempo with that, okay? So this is kind of a side view of that thing. So if this was the center of, call it Fallujah, from surface to 5 miles out, this was this ring, and we would put all of our Cobras and attack helicopters on the outside of the city. And then above the city, out to a 15-mile ring, we would stack F-16s, F-18s, Harriers, AC-130s, et cetera. And then inside, or right on the ring, right on the 5-mile ring, here, we would put unmanned aerial vehicles to do reconnaissance day and night. And we also used some other manned assets that were owned by other government agencies in the middle of there. And so the whole idea was we were not going to stop for anyone. Aircraft were going to be dropping bombs down. Artillery was going to be shooting in. Cobras were going to be shooting in. And it was a big circle, right? This is not a nonlinear battlefield. This is not the quintessential coordinated fire line and we're going to shoot over it. Everyone's shooting into the middle, which is highly dangerous, okay? And UAVs are running around and everyone's shooting at the exact same time to build tempo. Big sky, little bullet theory, okay? It's high risk, but it's what you needed to, because we were, you know, we didn't want to get stopped again, and we wanted to solve this problem once and for all quickly. And that's why tempo was important. That's what it looked like overlaying the city of Fallujah. These squares are battle positions where helicopters would be. There's the 5-mile ring, and the planes would stack on the south, east, north, or west sector. They'd show up, they'd check in with me or someone like me. I would hand them to a forward air controller that was on the ground in the city, or I'd use them myself, depending on who needed targeting. And then we would prioritize based on how active the threat was and who needed the air power the most. Okay?
So the ground forces, or the ground forces are calling it, so that the Marines in the city or something could call in an F-18 or whatever.
Yes, I would hand them to one of my, I had about 35-ish, don't quote me on that, forward air controllers in the city, as well as I went in the city usually every day or every other day. And so we all had a PRC-90 or a PRC-117 strapped to our back, and we could call in fires from fixed wing, rotary wing, and even UAVs, because Predators were dropping at the same time, okay? And we used the AC-130 extensively at night. Most of the time, around 2 in the morning, AC-130 gunships would come in. For those of you who might recall, they have 25 millimeter, they have 40 millimeter, and 105 millimeter howitzer. Extremely accurate. The AC-130s traditionally only flew as a single ship, and they only fly at night. But because of the drive for tempo, I asked the Air Force, the CFAC, the commander of the forces, of the Air Forces, can you fly 2 of them? And he looked at me funny, and I said, I'd like 2 of them to go counter-rotating 500-foot stack like this, inside that 5-mile ring. He thought I was nuts. And maybe I am, but I still asked. But the bottom line is, we got him to say yes. And then I said, look, during Vigilant Resolve, we would go Winchester. They would run out of ammunition early in the night, and there were still plenty of targets to be prosecuted. So we actually, a young airman said, sir, we need to ask for permission to floor load ammunition because it's dangerous having too much on the floor, the net explosive weight and the weight of the air, and they approved it. So we floor loaded 25 and 40 millimeter grenades, tons of it in there. So they were up there all night. And I just give 1 to RCT-7 and 1 to RCT-1, and those guys were, they were the most desired asset at night. They could see everything, they were precise, they shot up improvised explosive devices, they shot up cars that we knew were wired with old bombs, 500,000-pound bombs, they'd be wired so when the Marines walked by they'd blow them. So they just kind of went down the streets and blew these things up, and it was great. Sir.
Did the enemy forces have centralized control and command?
They did, and it was actually fairly good. We tried to mitigate that by putting a Prowler, an EA-6B, just south of the field. That's about all I can say, jamming into their command nodes. And of course, we deconflicted our frequencies so that it wouldn't jam us too. But yeah, they had fairly sophisticated, and in the city, because it's a very Byzantine, tightly, closely spaced city, and the buildings are all made of concrete, because all you got is sand, right? There's no wood structures there. Everything is reinforced rebar, your house would be, and 5,000 PSI concrete. And initially, we were dropping bombs, and the bombs were skipping off the top of the houses if you had a steel nose plug, if you didn't have a steel nose plug. And that's dangerous. If you've ever seen a 500-pound bomb skip down the street past you, it gets your full attention, I can tell you. So, but what was happening is because of the reinforced concrete in the city there, and we learned this really before we got into this battle, is that the bomb would go in and all that reinforced concrete would just strip the bomb body weight like a cheese grater, and it would just be a little bang and it wouldn't kill them. So we solved that. We'd put a steel nose plug in and we'd drop two, one behind the other, 0.25 milliseconds. So one would blow a hole in the rebar, one would go right in to the second story and take care of it. But I'll show you some pictures of that here later. Anyway, so this is kind of what close air support is, the CAS, holding altitudes. So we would stack, these are all UAVs. We had the first night, I think I had 13 UAVs check in with me, and I would control one or two of them. The agency would control one of them, and then I'd hand the rest of them to the forward air controllers out there. And we had everything from handheld, hand-thrown ones in Marines' backpacks to Predators to Global Hawk. We had manned assets that, not to be named here, and other things that were all either building intelligence or feeding video down to the Marine reconnaissance units and the Marine units on the ground. And it was quite an active night or two or three. Okay. These are just the rotary wing battle positions. We had HMLA, helicopter marine light attack, Cobras and Hueys. They would pull into these positions on the outside. And remember, we're shooting into a circle. They were shooting mostly Hellfire, which is a laser-guided weapon that has a lock-on before launch. So you'd lock on with your laser and pop up and shoot your laser there. The warhead would, or the weapon would lock on, and it would kind of direct line of sight, okay? That's problematic once there becomes lots of smoke and rubble, because the laser gets broken up and the scatter, you don't know where it's going to go. And we couldn't afford that because lots of times we were shooting well inside of 100 meters, sometimes within 60 meters of friendlies. So 60 meters, having a 500-pound bomb going off is way, way inside of danger close, okay? The other thing is, in Iraq and many of the cities in the Middle East, they pirate all the electricity. So on one telephone pole or there would be a billion lines that, Joe went up and hooked his power line on, and then he would pull power to his house. And there's lines all over the place. And when your laser hits that, again, it refracts all over, and then you're not sure. So we would use lock-on after launch, where the missile would go up and come down, and we'd laze from a UAV or a F-18 straight down and come in and impact from the top down. Water in the city was a problem. These are all things that you don't think about, but when you go into a city where they don't have the roads like we do, the water pipes were only inches underneath the pavement. So when you run in there with armored vehicles or tanks, it would crush those. The water would start to leak out, and now that's another refractive thing where the laser energy refracts off the water and it goes all over the place, okay? I guess the takeaway is that we're all shooting into this shooting gallery, circular shooting gallery, and if the missile goes long, guess what? It goes into a glide for 13 kilometers and ends up with one of your buddies that shot it across the way. Again, high risk, but we did it anyway. Artillery positions. Most of the artillery came from the Marine Reserve Battery, 12th Marines. These guys were awesome. They were shooting steel on steel. It would go from here, and we were shooting with what's called a Delta T. Remember, the Marines are coming in from this straight down. And most of the time you'd have your artillery back here shooting over its head. So if it went a little bit long, we're shooting into the face of oncoming Marines and soldiers. And these guys were hitting exactly, literally, steel on steel or the house that they hit. And they used all sorts of techniques. Lots of times when we drop a bomb on a house, the insurgents would come out, or they'd wait for usually 3 to 5 minutes. When the dust settled, the insurgents from surrounding houses would come in, and they would come in and either look for their buddies, or at least they wanted their weapons and ammunition because they knew they were surrounded. And so lots of times, once they came to the next house, we'd shoot 8 rounds of HEVT in kind of a circular pattern, and it would be like a shotgun on an ant's nest, and that worked out pretty well. Not to get too graphic, but okay. So we spent a lot of time as a lesson learned building a grid reference graphic. Every Marine and aviator, I don't care what you were at in that city, in your right cargo pocket, you had a grid reference graphic that everyone had the same exact map, same grid, same numbered buildings on a lot of the buildings, probably several hundred buildings, so that you could quickly identify a target and it would speed the tempo of operations. Okay, I already talked about that. Little UAV, big sky theory. Schweitzer, that was a manned asset. Okay, and on that 5-mile ring, so here's the city. AC-130s would circle up here at night, shooting into the city. We'd have usually 3 or 4 UAVs on this track, 3 or 4 UAVs on this track, and maybe a couple others that were on the ring circling. So 10 or so unmanned aerial vehicles, some armed, some unarmed, all collecting intelligence, all beaming back down to a mobile remote station in some cases coming right back to me, and I would guide targeting or call in fires from there.
Gary, where were you when this was going on? What was your physical location?
Fallujah here. I mean, so we had a COC just outside the city, right here, well, no, right here. And then during the days, I would usually go in the city, me or Dan Sirkin, who was my assistant air officer. And we would take turns. We would rotate in the city or back at the COC. So, yeah, so about half the time I was in the city and half the time I was there.
What were you doing in the city?
So I would go.
Seeing the results, or?
We would coordinate with our forward air controllers, our regimental air controllers, our air officers, and we would determine if we needed to make adjustments to the plan. Of course, I had a radio because I was generally there with General Natonsky, who I would go in with. He was the division commander. And then we would usually, most of the time, we would go in a light armored vehicle, a C-squared light armored vehicle, so a command and control light armored vehicle. Sometimes I was nothing more than an additional rifleman. And other times I was a radio operator, and other times I was a planner. So it was very dynamic, depending on the day and the situation.
Were there any civilians left in there?
Yes, there was about, probably estimates somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000, but not many, out of 269,000. So there was some civilians left, and we didn't, there was never, one of the proudest things in this thing, 10 battalions in the city, dropping bombs, shooting artillery, mortars, everything simultaneously, and we never had a blue on blue. And that's probably what I'm most proud of with this plan. Okay? We'll get through this, and then we'll open it up for this is, if you remember way back to, how fire's deconfliction worked. You'd have a coordinated fire line, and normally it would be a linear line, and you would shoot without coordinating the higher headquarters into that box. We just made it a box because it was circular, and then we collapsed the box as we got closer and closer. So we did the same for the stuff. You can see the stuff we put in there in a relatively short order, 318 laser guided, mostly bombs, a whole bunch of rockets and missiles, lots of machine gun, 6,000 rounds of artillery. Artillery's coming in from over here up to a highest of 8,500 feet. Fixed wing are staying above 9,000. UAVs are in there, and everyone's shooting at the same time with 6 battalions of U.S. and 4 Iraqi battalions. It was, active, to say the least. Okay, what is that? 9,000 rounds of down here. nearly 9,000 rounds of mortars going into the city. That's ours. That doesn't include what's coming out of the city.
In what period of time did that happen?
This is from November 7th to 90% of all that was through about the 13th or 14th. Yeah. There were small pockets of cleanup after that, but that was the majority. Again, that's what it looked like early on, 36 commandos going up. Everyone's staged. We blew a hole. We came down with blocking forces. That's just a picture of how the Byzantine streets of an old city in the Middle East look. Everything is flat roof, easy to hide, walls on the top of the roof, so it's very hard to find a sniper up there. A lot of the insurgents would knock holes through the buildings. So they'd knock a hole from one building to another so they could run from one building to the other without ever going outside. Fairly, okay. And we talked about that. This is what we did, and this is how it ended up. We initially thought we were going to come in and kind of student body right and go to the river. But the majority of the fighting, the heaviest fighting, was right here in the Jolan Park and then just south. And so we just decided to keep our momentum and keep going south. And we basically swept from north to south. And then we came back and we went back again, clearing and house-to-house fighting. So the ISF, the Iraqi forces that we fought along with the Peshmerga, the Kurds, who were very happy to go in and kill insurgents and anyone that was related in any way to Saddam, because Saddam had gassed the Kurds. And so I was talking to one of the Peshmerga soldiers the day before we went in, and he says, "Oh yes, I'm very happy to be here," and he was, and they were good. They were good. The best thing is they could tell an accent that the guy wasn't an Iraqi. They knew the architecture, so they could find all the hidden caches of weapons, and they knew the city, and so they were very valuable from that perspective. Okay, but identifying foreign fighters was probably the biggest thing. We got a lot of intelligence from them. And we would be standing at a checkpoint about to let the guy go, and the Iraqi would say, "He's a Syrian. Check his car." And we'd check it, and sure enough, he was a Syrian. It would be like, I couldn't pick up a Texas accent or you, but they could, okay? I could. Okay? Enemy tactics. We're down to the last couple slides. Enemy tactics. Lots of improvised explosive devices all over the city. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, that's what that VBIED is. So a lot of times they'd park a car on the side of the street, they'd put 500-pound bombs. Remember, there was 104 weapons caches when we went into Iraq. I'm not saying if it's good or right or wrong, but there was 104 unprotected weapons caches left in Iraq when we got there in 2004. It was like a Home Depot of weapons, except you didn't have to pay for anything. As long as you could haul it out, it's yours. They would go in and we would have cars drive up next to our Marines and blow up with 500-pound bombs in the back. We found the block of a Cadillac or a Chevy a quarter-mile away, the block of the engine. So you can imagine what kind of explosive force. I'm sorry?
So in the city, were there like vehicles all over?
Parked, yes, just like any city. Yeah, they were just parked along the side of the road. So when you walked by, obviously you were hyper-vigilant anyway, as many of you know, that you get this exhilarating hypervigilance that courses through your veins. But okay, a lot of booby traps I talked about. They would put speakers in rooms with what sounded like a woman being tortured, only to have the door booby trapped. And in some cases there was someone in there. Sometimes it was just a video recording or an audio recording. So they did all that. They used all the mosques because they knew that our rules of engagement didn't allow us to blow up the mosque wholesale. In some cases we had to because there were snipers hiding in the tops of mosques, so you got to do what you got to do. Tunnel systems we talked about, weapons caches. Even on the top of the water tower, they had mortars and rifles stored on the top of a huge water tower. I mean, I walk up, I couldn't believe it. Drug use was rampant. So a lot of the insurgents, these supposed religious fanatics who use this false religious garb as their cover story, they were all amped up on opioids and methamphetamines. and they would pre-tourniquet themselves. So they would have a belt on each arm and each leg, and so when you shot them, they would just pull the tourniquet, and they were all amped up on crystal meth or whatever, and then they'd keep coming. And so you had to, obviously, accuracy was important, and 1 or 2 extra rounds didn't hurt. Well, it didn't hurt. It hurt them, but it didn't hurt us. You know what I mean. So this is some of the stuff we discovered. Those red dots are all weapons caches. I mean, everywhere in the city, they had been just storing and storing and storing. IED factories, all these blue dots where they would make IEDs, and you'd go in and they had big vats of explosives and all sorts of stuff. C2 nodes you asked about, there's lots of them all over, and they were actually fairly sophisticated and fairly effective until we started to jam them or destroy them. Okay. And then hostage locations. There were several places where we found actual live hostages, some that were under severe duress or being tortured.
Those weapons caches, were they mapped out? Did they have maps telling them where they could find a?
So it was more local. So like
just find it.
Yeah, so if you lived in the Jolan Park and you were going to be an insurgent in this area, you knew where all the ones that were up there were. And so what they would do is they would shoot, and instead of carrying all their stuff, they'd just shoot and run, and then they'd go to the next weapons cache, pick up another AK, and there was every kind of weapon you could imagine. I'll show you some pictures if we have time, but there's everything from handheld, rocket-propelled grenades to you name it, they had it. So lots of IEDs. Okay. So this is some of the stuff we found. Chemical agent making manuals, insurgent ledgers, passports, a lot of propaganda. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your view, we had Marines go through every body, every corpse that we, and go through and look for intelligence. It's a gruesome job, but anyway, that's where we found a lot of this stuff. Or some of it, I would say, not a lot. Okay. These are just some of the things that they would do. I'll just highlight a few of them. Human corpse IED. So they would take one of their fallen, they would stuff him full of a detonator and C4. And so as anyway, a lot of them in the southern part of the city would tie a grenade into their underneath their arm. So as their last act, as they were shot and they went down, they would pull the pin. So if you came and moved them, you would frag yourself. So that was another favorite of theirs. Sniper incident during humanitarian assistance. Yeah, we found some gross things. Let me see. Suspected hostage. Yeah, the fighting in the cemeteries the cemeteries there aren't like ours with little headstones. They have these big, huge, I don't know what you'd call them, but they're big like memorials to the family, and they sit up high, and so and they're Byzantine, they're not all lined up, and at night the young Marines would go in there and it could get very close combat, hand to hand in some cases. Okay. Yeah, I already covered that, grenades. Okay. This was the biggest one that you learn in combat, I think. Improvise, improvise, improvise. And then get the plan out early and study the plan. Okay. And again, the reason I'm here talking to you today is really to highlight the unbelievable courage that these young Marines and soldiers displayed on the battlefield. There's a lot of folks that say, oh, these young guys and gals, they're different they are different. But one thing that remains the same is that their steadfast commitment to the Constitution of the United States, and that they each sign a blank check, payable by their life to defend the principles that govern our nation. And I saw miraculous displays of courage from these soldiers and Marines. that unbelievable. Just like you've all seen and just like you've all demonstrated. So with that, we need to get more conversation and less talking. And if you got, that's kind of a quick down and dirty. I got a couple pictures I can show you. They're just of the city and things like that. They were taken pretty much after the end of the battle. I can pull up. And then hopefully we'll use the remaining time, however long we're going to be here, to have donuts, coffee, and then talk about whatever the conversation part is, because I don't want to bore you any longer.
Show the pictures, please.
Yeah, they're not in any slideshow or anything, but if we can pull some of those up, all right, they're just on that stick, Mike, and there are no, I didn't put them in a PowerPoint or anything, so you may just have to click individual ones, and I can describe some of them, or they're. That's just a picture from the back of an LAV or of one of the mosques. That's right on the main street. And if you go to the next one, that's an insurgent flag that we captured in one of the buildings. And that's a D9. That's an armored bulldozer. Those guys, the combat engineers, are awesome. They push anything out of the way while they're taking fire, sitting in their armored cab. And
For the combat engineer.
I mean, the rubble. So the rubble in a city is a bad. It greatly limits your mobility, both vehicle-borne and foot-borne. And so if you don't have these guys to push it out of the way, it slows your tempo. And our whole plan was based on tempo. And so these guys were worth their weight in gold. That's just a young Iraqi boy giving a thumbs up. I would go, if you pause and go back for just a second, I'll tell you one quick sea story. From Camp Fallujah, where we would drive into the city in the mornings for those that weren't there the whole time, I'll never forget, there was this young girl standing in the middle of the desert, probably about the same age as my daughter at the time, probably about 5 or 6. She's a mile and a half out in the desert, no one around, artillery's going overhead, helicopters. She'd known nothing but war her entire life, right? And she was dressed every single day in this crushed red velvet dress, like she was dressed for Christmas or Easter. And she stood there with all of her dignity, upright, waving. She never begged, she never asked for anything. And a lot of Marines would give her their meal ready to eat or part of it or whatever as they went in knowing they were going to do bad things to bad people. But this young girl kind of slaved your moral compass right before you went into the city and made sure that whatever spiritual armor you needed, you had, that there was someone in there worth saving, there was someone in there worth fighting for, and that she just made sure that you maintained and kept your honor clean before you went in there. And I'll never forget that girl. I always wondered what happened to her, but I saw her for about 7 days in a row, and then I never saw her again. And she was always in the same red dress, smiling, cute little girl. Anyway, it's funny the things you remember and what it means. And you don't know what it means at the time necessarily, but it's meant more over time as you reflect on what that girl did for us, not the other way around, to make sure that we were professional warriors. So anyway, that's just a checkpoint, Bradley fighting vehicle. Some would say that's cooking oil. Others would say that they're making something that's probably not good. You can go to the next slide. So this was, all those red dots, this was just one of thousands. Humongous mortars, you name it. There was unlimited amounts of ammunition in the city.
Did you blow those up, Gary? Is it what you did?
Well, we didn't blow, not then, because it would have been too explosive in the city, and we didn't know what the next door or what was buried or what. So we just hauled it out of there, but we didn't blow it up. And some of it we didn't even move, quite frankly, because it was so old and it was so dangerous. This was just a place where we found a video, and this is one of the rooms that was recording, and it had a just continuous loop of a screaming, lady being tortured and obviously wanting you to come in with a booby-trap door. That's what a tank does to the side of a building. And you can see that was a block building. Some of them were cement. and others were actual block, but the roof is still cement, which caused a lot of weaponeering challenges. That's when I fell down on the side. No. I don't know what happened there, but I was probably just, real quick. Okay, these are rocket-propelled grenades of every type. You saw there wasn't a favorite. They'd take a Russian one, a Chinese made, a US made, whatever was available, they were going to shoot it at you. Okay, this is just one of the Iraqi soldiers I threw in there. Very, very competent. He's got his radio in his hand. He's got his machine gun. He's a young Peshmerga Kurd. And again, there's plenty of patriots in every country, and he was one of them. And we held elections, I'd say, on patriotism after this, the first ever elections in Iraq. And so we set up these election facilities that Marines aren't, that's not our job title, but we do what we're asked to do. And the election was going to have people come in from all over. There was about 100, I think, folks on the ballot. There was no pictures, there was no platform. Nobody knew what they were voting for, but they just knew they were voting for something better. Each person that went to the polling booth would get their finger put in indelible ink, which wouldn't wash off for about 2 to 3 days. Knowing, because the insurgents spread the word that, hey, if you vote, we'll cut your hand off at the minimum or kill you. And we had a higher turnout than we do in the US, okay? And I'll never forget one lady. It was an extremely cold day in January after this happened. It was probably in the high 30s or 40s, wind was blowing. She walked about 4 or 5 miles carrying her baby to the election booth, right? We can't get people to go to the post office or the local school in an air-conditioned car. This lady walked with her kid at risk of her life because she knew they were either going to kill her or cut off her hand, and she came and she voted anyway, okay? If that doesn't tell you something about patriotism and wanting something different, okay? That's just a street in the city. These are Marines preparing to go in and clear the complex behind them. Again, I couldn't say enough about these young Marines. I saw them arguing about who's going in first. And they would say, you went in first last time, I'm going in first. No, bull, you went in. Knowing damn well that there was going to be insurgents, booby traps, IEDs, etc. And they were arguing who's going in first. All the time, all day long. And then just the tenacity. I showed up at the government center and we were having this kind of a hasty meeting in the middle. It was right downtown. The government center is in the middle of the city of Fallujah. And this young lieutenant shows up and he's about a minute late, right? Who cares? He's a minute late. And he says, hey, sir, I'm sorry, And he's kind of sitting like this. I'm like, hey, it's okay. We haven't started. Just get a canteen or some water. He's like, and then I noticed his fingers shot off right here at the knuckle, right? So his finger's gone. I say, hey, what happened? He said, oh, no, nothing. Where's the meeting? I'm like, hey, it's okay. I'm like, hey, what happened? He's like, oh, no, nothing, sir. I'm ready to go. Where's the meeting? I'm like, look, you're not ready to go. Your finger's blown off. Do you have it? He's like, no, I don't have it. I'm like, okay, well then, push some gauze in that hole, or for God's sake, or it's something. But he's all worried about getting to a meeting when his finger's shot off, right? That he's a minute late. Okay, that's the kind of tenacity that these young men and women displayed all the time, and many of you, you've seen it. Another staff sergeant, while we were sitting there, we used the Amtrak as ambulances, and he comes. They roll up and they open the door of the ambulance, and he's got multiple bullet holes in him. And he lays over, he rolls over, and he looks at me and he said, "Hey, sir, how you doing?" I'm like, "Better than you." And he said, he goes, "Yeah, but look at this." And he pulls out a little pocket camera. And it was the guy that shot him that he shot. I was like, I said, well, good for you. Anyway, he was fine, but we had to put a couple of quarts of oil in him, but he was good. All right, next slide. I just thought that was funny, so I took a picture of it. In the middle of the city, somewhere near the government center, it says no guns. I thought, that's humorous. So this is a picture of a sniper hide in the city. So you knock out a little mouse hole, and then what you don't see right before is that there's two guys sitting right here, and they're playing cards. because they're on like 5-hour shifts of sniping people. So one guy would do the reconnaissance. One guy would shoot. 2 guys would play cards, and then every time they shot someone, they'd rotate positions to keep their mental awareness up, So anyway, that's a picture of the city. I got a call from about day 4. Someone from the National Geodetic Agency sends a message and says, hey, from our estimate, it looks like there's very limited collateral damage in the city of Fallujah. Can you verify this? So I typed up a nice one-liner and said, please don't do collateral damage estimates from space. I'm inviting you to come walk the ground for yourself. and I never got a response back. So anyway, okay. Next slide, if there is a next. That's it? Okay, yeah. So, sir.
Have you been back to Fallujah since 2004?
Not to Fallujah, but I've been back to Iraq multiple times since, yeah.
Any idea on how the city has come back to life, repaired itself?
So it's fallen back into, so in 2014, ISIS took it over. And then in 2016, the Iraqi Armed Forces took back both Fallujah and Ramadi. So it's ebbed and flowed. And a lot of people say, what a waste. Well, no. You set the conditions for success based on our policies and objectives. And then as a sovereign nation, you hand it to them on a golden platter and they do with it what they want, because we can't be the nation's or the world's police force forever. So is it tragic that we lose ground? Maybe, I don't know. But yeah, it's lost ground, and now it's back under the Iraqi Armed Forces controls, and they took it on their own. And to me, that says a lot, because they couldn't have done it before. But yes, so one of my tours, I worked at Central Command with General Mattis. I was his executive assistant, and so we traveled, every country from India, south of Russia, to Israel and the Caucasus, pretty much all of them. So I served in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, UAE, Bahrain, Israel, Egypt, Thailand, India, you name it. So I've seen a lot of the Middle East. I think we covered 50 nations during 2 tours with him, or maybe not just with him, but 50 nations, I think, over the time I was in the Marine Corps, and a lot of that in the Middle East. And interesting. Iraq was a lot different than Afghanistan is. Afghanistan was much different. The Iraqis, obviously the terrain is much different. The Hindu Kush in the eastern side, RC East in Afghanistan, is high altitude, higher than the Rockies, and you're fighting up there with people who have been doing it for thousands of years, who are warriors, who like to fight, and every one of their generations have fought. They're not afraid to fight, where the Iraqis weren't quite the warriors that the Afghanis are. So that's a different day.
I think the big challenge, what you saw from that, is the decimation that occurs in urban fighting. I mean, there's no way of not preventing massive destruction.
Yeah, we had because of the leaflet drops, we had very little to almost no civilian casualties, and we had no blue on blue, which was significant in that dense of an environment. Because as the density increases, the complexity goes up, astronomically. And there were some close calls, obviously, but thank God that we didn't have any blue on blue. Sir?
What do you think of the Iraqi government today, stability, and you think and the society in general?
Yeah. So I'll start with the society in general. I think there's good people everywhere. I've met patriotic, loyal people. They may not believe in the same stuff we do, but they believe in their belief system, and they're patriotic to their country and their nation. Most of them all want the same thing that you and I do. They want clean water, an ability to do business, to make a life for their family, and protect their kids and have that. And I say that having met in Afghanistan, going back to that, I sat in a tent with 3 Taliban, right? Indian style on the floor, 3 Taliban, General Mattis, myself, and one other officer with 3 Taliban. And they want the same stuff for the most part. But there are fanatics, and there's some of the fanatics ruin the religion or ruin the country because they're fanatical, and all they want to do is destroy things, not build things or make things better. But I'd say they're the great minority. I'd say that your average Iraqi wanted, they don't want the same stuff Americans do, but they want the same, basic livelihood. In terms of the government, I can't comment on the government anymore because I'm too removed from it. I used to be fairly well versed in it. I would say that most of the Middle East is very tribal in nature. I would say there's a level of corruption that is tolerated there in the Middle East, and I'm maybe stereotyping a bit, that is more acceptable than we find it, although we have our own levels of corruption. Let's not kid ourselves, okay? And so what is the level of corruption that you're willing to deal with? We had corrupt mayors in Ramadi, and we used to, quite frankly, have a betting pool on how long they would last, because some other corrupt wannabe governor would shoot him or kill him or whatever. I'm not sure I have high confidence in the government as they run it, but they have made great strides recently, and there's a lot of good people in the government. But the government there doesn't have the same, governance only works if people abide by the policies that are set forth. And just because the governor or the president of a country says this is the law, the tribal leader says, no, I run this tribe and I run this area, and we don't do it that way. And that's just the way it is. Nobody thinks twice about it, right? And so it's hard to maintain a homogeneous governance when you have a system that's set up like that. Anyway, that's a vague answer to a long question. That's like a year I spent at War College,
Should we have a universal draft over here?
No, I don't think so. You're talking about for the U.S.?
Yes, sir.
To have a draft? I don't think so. Not yet. Do you think we need it?
Yes, because I want you scared and I want me scared that my daughters and the people you care about might get shot or hurt in some way.
You mean for the country to buy in totally?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
we have folks going, oh yeah, let's go here or there.
Yeah.
And it's like,
Well, there's certainly there's certainly something to be said for having the entire country behind you and buying in and having skin in the game, so to speak. So I don't disagree with that. But that said, I don't think we need it right now. Maybe we will if we go up against a near-peer competitor, Russia, China. Maybe we'll see it then. And I hope the young men and women will stand up and say, yeah, I'm ready to go, and you won't have to. And the reason I say that is because the most lethal weapon on the battlefield is attitude. And it starts in the most deadly place on the battlefield is the 6 inches between your ears. And it's how you react. There's a saying that says what counts most in combat can't be counted. And it starts in here and in here. And if you have people that don't want to participate, it's hard to change the attitude. It can be changed, but it takes longer than people who start with a good attitude and want to be there. And that's the reason I say what I do. So it's an interesting, if we get into a near-peer competitor and you end up in a we're not going to get in any longer term, right? We've been at war for 20 years, right? Or maybe 212, I don't know how many. But it's been a long time.
yeah.
The question isn't, in my mind, can you sustain it from a manpower? It's can the economic primacy of America sustain itself to man, arm, and equip and train the forces to have an adequate peer advantage over the enemy. And if you can't maintain your economic house, you certainly can't maintain the force structure and the training and the level of competency that you need when something like this happens. And quite frankly, this was easy. There was, I don't say easy, let me back that up. This was in relative terms. There wasn't a significant air threat to the aircraft. There was a huge threat to the Marines and the soldiers on the ground. I mean, it couldn't get any more severe, clearing buildings and knife fighting and everything else. But anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Do you think Trump's new Space Force is essential?
You know, I haven't read enough about it to know. I know that space is a domain that if we don't operate in it, someone else will, and we already do operate in it. We have for what, 15, 20 years, maybe more. I mean, actively. I'm less concerned about the structure. Is it its own force? Is it? I don't know. We've been doing that via the Air Force and other assets for a long time. What I do know is that they got the best guy for the job, General James Mattis, and if he thinks it's a good idea, then it's a good idea. Because I've never heard him come up with a bad idea yet, and I've known him for a long time and worked directly with him for 24/7 for years, and been all over the world with him, and probably one of the finest humans I've ever met. And he is a dedicated, I mean, he's done nothing but warfight his whole life. Anyway, if he knows, if he says it's a good idea, then I'm all in. I don't need to read the paper. Okay.
I noticed that you mentioned that there was SEAL teams.
Yes.
Was there any Marine Force recon?
Yeah, they were, and they were on the south end blocking, and they had a significant play in the south end of the city where that coordinated firebox was. They were active all through that area because when the insurgents tried to come out, they were met by a friendly team of Force Recon Marines, and they weren't that friendly. But yeah, they were active there. Anglico teams, Marine Recon, along with Shawnee Special Forces, all blocking that area. And we had a whole bunch of crazy agencies, 3-letter acronyms that were all over that city as well. So, folks, you need more coffee or donuts?
Well, Gary, thank you so much for giving us a fantastic.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
So please stick around. I have a lot of questions for Gary as well. And so we have more donuts and everything, but please come up and visit, ask whatever questions.